let's get started. So thanks for coming to my talk, and thanks for hanging in there. So I know the drinks are next, but my name's Emma Garland. I'm one of the Emmas, so it's also Emma Burstow, and may there be many more Emmas. So I work at Rock Solid Knowledge, which is a Bristol-based digital agency. Carl also works there. And what I'm going to talk about today is basically the concept of content first, so using like a hybrid and a headless CMS, how we actually use this in our companion apps, and the process of collaborating together, building these apps amongst the two teams. So, anyone been to Gloucester? Basically, it's a city up kind of north of Bristol. And the example I'm going to use for this talk is actually the Gloucester History Festival website that we built. Basically, we were commissioned to build the website, but also build a companion app alongside it. It's a history festival. There's people like Tony Robinson going to do talks there, and like the world's loudest town crier, things like that. So yeah, we built it using Umbraco, which is our CMS of choice, which we love. And one thing I really like about Umbraco is the flexibility you have to be able to store data types and have different kind of custom doc types and that kind of thing. So, is anyone working in true content first at the moment? Basically, the concept of content first is something that I really feel helped the success of this application. So if you've ever done like entity framework development and you build the code first and that actually builds up the database for you, it's kind of a similar way. You're thinking of like building the content before you build the app. So design follows the content. And Headless CMS kind of naturally leads itself to this approach. And if you're interested in domain modeling, there's a domain-driven design book by Eric Evans, and there's a couple of good books that Ismail recommended. So what is a content model? Well, essentially, it's a self-describing, formalized structure of its semantics, small chunks of content. So if you've worked in Umbraco, you will be familiar with this. It allows you to reuse things, and it's kind of like a formal representation of structure and the relationships between the two things. And when we're doing content modeling, the way we kind of look at it is you mine the content, so you go and you kind of define your content models. Then you define these further, so you build up structure, and you audit what you've modeled, and then you sort of refine that even further. And this is something that's, if you're interested in content first, Cleve Gibbon, he's like a really good kind of person who does that. So Content Wrangler, he has a blog about this. But I just think it's quite good to remember, so mine, define, and refine. And who should be involved in this? Well, essentially everyone. So all key stakeholders should be involved in this process. So designers, information architects, developers, BAs, so basically everyone that kind of works on the website. So what we're going to do is a process of like modeling the domain universe. So the domain is the area that you're working in. One thing I really like about building websites is you get to kind of learn about a whole different area that you're working in. So if you're building a website on, I don't know, about cats, then you learn about cats and beer, that kind of thing. So what we want to do is take a step back from the process and really understand the domain we're working in before we do anything else on the build. I just really like this 404 page from Slack, but basically you kind of imagine the whole domain as a beautiful universe. You're not really thinking too much or overanalyzing it at this stage. You're just kind of thinking anything that comes into your head. So just everything about the domain. Don't overanalyze things, which I know a lot of us are prone to do. So we're going to do some audience participation, which I know everyone loves. I hate sitting at the front just in case. But yeah, what we're going to do is we're going to domain model a festival, which is what we're here now. So we can just come up with some, what do you think of when you think of a festival? Beer? Mud, yeah. People, music. Yeah. Expensive, overpriced food, yeah. So you do this process, you would actually, you'd do this a bit more formally and you'd write things down, but you'd come up with everything, you've come up with some other ones I hadn't thought of, that you think of to do with the festival, and that's your domain, like the world you're working in. And then you actually would then go further and zoom in on one of those areas. So if we look into an event, we look at that as a domain object. So start thinking about everything in detail that an event represents to you. So if you think of an event, clue we're at one. So just anything you think of to do with it. Yeah, start time, location, yeah, name. So yeah, you basically zoom in on the domain and build up the domain object. And so yeah, location, duration, that kind of thing. So this might start to sound familiar to those of you who are interested in object-oriented programming. You're actually building up the attributes that make up the domain that you're working in, and you're really zooming in and mining that content. There's one thing missing so far as well, because we've talked about domain models, but we haven't talked about the relationships between them. So this is the taxonomy, the connective tissue that holds things together. So if you think of like a planet, the moon, or a wheel and a spoke, when you started out programming, if you're a developer, you probably learnt this as your first thing about object-oriented programming. So yeah, the inheritance and the relationships between things, it's important to understand that structure. And so this is just an example content model that I've come up with for the event space and the festival space. So we've got the event here. You've got the meetups are a type of event. Thanks. Festivals are, another type of event. A user group would organize these events, and these are some of the properties we talked about. So location and date. And this is an example using hours. So I'm just going to have some of this one. Really shaky. Basically, what we then start to do is we really kind of define these domain models from something abstract into something quite concrete. So we're now building up a specification. And if you're familiar with Umbraco, then the document types that we work with, these would actually be something formalized now into more of a specification. So we've structured our content, and we're really formalizing this all has meaning now. So we're building up this beautiful domain model. So was anyone at Mark and Lee's talk at Code Garden? Yeah. So they did atomic design, which was basically a way of thinking about content and thinking of it in a more scientific way. It's just one way you might want to use to formalize the process of content modeling. So you break things down to the smallest piece, so like atoms are the smallest, they would probably be something like properties. Molecules would be compositions and so on, and building them up till we get templates and pages. And Brad Frost coined this, so if you're interested in atomic design, then he does a lot of blogs about that, and he's got some videos about it as well. So yeah, the advantage of doing this is it's kind of like it's a common scientific language for everyone to use, so everyone's sharing this same language. You might not want to do this, it works for some people. We've tried it recently, and it helps the way we organize our doc types and things into folders within Umbraco. So why would we do this content first, and how does this help with our app building? Well, basically, we are all working with, we understand the domain, so we're using a shared language together. We can ask for copy in advance, so this would save time in future with maybe translations, and we can optimize our search early, so we understand the search indices, so on. And we can also start thinking about cross-platform personalization. So once we've got the content, we're kind of building up a picture, no matter what channel you're on, based on your content choices, like if you're using Netflix apps or website, whichever one you're using, it's going to understand the picture of you because they have a really clear idea of their domain model. And then we can also do this to rapidly prototype. So we can actually take this and use it to output to an actual website early. So I don't know if you've ever found, like, lorem ipsum, when you come to actually put the real content in, it doesn't really cut it anymore. So yeah, you might have some lorem ipsum that's really short, and then the editor actually needs something a lot bigger. If we've content modeled in advance, then we can understand more what the design is going to look like in the end. So model content first, and the design kind of follows and melds around that. Yeah, so basically, there's lots of different rapid prototyping tools. I'm not sure, some of you might have used, like, Tailwind. I know Matt has done talks on that. And you could just literally put it out 90s style kind of HTML, raw, building up like a basic wireframe of a site, and then developing that site in future. So because you understand the content model first, you can actually build this up, and it becomes like an electronic living wireframe. So yeah, some things you might be thinking, how does content modeling help? How would this help with building an app and a companion app? And how does Headless fit into this? So because we've done this content modeling up front, we're actually able to build up a formalized API specification. And this is something we actually did for the Glastonbury History Festival. We built up a structure of a document, and we share it amongst the teams so everyone understands what the API methods are, what the responses should be, what the JSON should look like. And because we've modeled the domain up front, we were able to build that first and basically share that amongst the teams. And I think this is one of the things that really helped speed up our build. So just before we go into that, the kind of more comfort zone, maybe, you're more familiar with, traditional non-headless CMS. So complex access control, so you've often got ability to set permissions for different users. You've got, you can do translations and build up workflows. There's quite a lot of usually drag and drop UIs that's had a lot of thought put into it, such as in Umbraco. You can quite often build up editable forms or install packages that do this. But essentially, we tend to find that a lot of these are quite web-oriented, so they start out thinking about the website rather than maybe other channels. I've been told by Lee that originally CMSs were more headless than they are now. But basically, a lot of the kind of 2000s onwards, everything was web-oriented. And so multi-channel approach can be quite an afterthought for that reason. That's kind of what it very basically normally looks like. So what you notice about this is you're responsible for everything. So security, performance, updates, hotfixes and versioning, everything is onto you. It's sort of baked in, it's all in the same, it's tightly coupled. So we're starting to think, if you're thinking of code smells, tightly coupled is something you don't want. You want things to be loosely coupled and able to be swapped out. So we could decouple it further by maybe separating them so you've got the CMS somewhere else, but essentially you're still having to keep these environments updated yourself. You tend to have sort of adding and editing CMS content. Then we're quite familiar with this workflow if you've used Umbraco. You edit the content, save and publish, and then the view would have some dynamic placeholders that represent the content updates. But we're not in that age anymore. We are now in the headless age. So only web-oriented solutions don't cut it anymore. There's new audiences, multiple channels, multiple touch points and ways that people want to manage their content. So you've got VR and AR, chatbots, Alexas, looking over at Carol, kiosks, consoles. There's so many ways that people can access and experience content. And And what they expect now is, in this omni-channel era, is basically a shift in thinking. So we're not able to just think about web anymore. They want the same experience regardless of what device they're on. So someone like MailChimp, they think a lot about their brand and the tone of voice and things. So they want to have one content hub, and then whichever channel you use to access that brand has the same personalized experience. So, yeah, definition of a headless CMS is basically you take the head off, so that's the view, how the content is presented to you. And then you're just left with the headless part. It's API first, and this is the Wikipedia definition. So you have like a RESTful API to access this content. So already we're seeing that this is separation of concerns, which starts to feel like a lot better for, we're starting to work in the way we like to in terms of coding. For headless CMS, it lets you build things essentially into microservices. So if you've kind of got multiple parts of your application, they're isolated. They are working in concert together rather than all being bundled together. So just to kind of demonstrate how it roughly would look, so you've got your website which accesses the API there, which is the headless API, and the headless API can access the CMS data. And then anything else, whether it's a website, whether it's a chatbot or anything, that accesses the content via the API. So the thing about this is these are already starting to look like replaceable parts. So they are able to communicate with each other, but you could also imagine you could swap them out quite independently of each other. Now, it's not to say headless is the only way. There are other advantages of building it in the traditional way, like everything. You could build quite quickly an out-the-box website. Headless does mean it's not out-the-box, so someone has still got to build the view. So I'm not using it as a golden hammer, but it's just to say there's a lot of advantages. So we've talked about separation of concerns. It's secure. It's often much more scalable. So the vendor, whoever is doing the headless CMS hosting, they're looking after it for you. So they're doing the updates, they're doing the security. They're kind of looking after the performance for you. So you might even have like a content delivery network in front of it. And yeah, basically, you've got full control over what happens. So you've got much more flexibility. You can put any layer you want in front of it and just access it via the API. So the content, headless CMS becomes the source of truth. So it's the content hub for any of your other applications. And so we've got Umbraco Cloud. You would probably consider platform as a service because you're kind of using it to host the website, whereas the headless would be more software as a service. So you're basically requesting to use the headless service, and you're not. It's just like vendor looks after it. You don't have to do anything with it. So that's just kind of a way of thinking about the two differences. Moving it to cloud, so you get updates automatically with Umbraco Cloud, and an Umbraco Headless you can actually access. If you go to umbraco.com/headless, you can get added to a beta to do a demo of it. And that's meant to look like that. Basically, there's no interference with the CMS or your code. So whereas if you pull down the whole CMS, you have to put up with whatever the CMS problems they have, performance. If there's performance issues on the CMS, your website would also be affected. This way, there's just no interference, and it's kept very isolated. So the Umbraco Headless example, I've just pulled down a quick demo just to check it out, really. It looks very similar to what you'd be used to in the back office. Has anyone here actually played with a headless beta yet? Yeah. So yeah, it looks very similar to what you're familiar with, but you don't have any of the view-related things. You don't have the templates or, you don't have packages at the moment either. But essentially, it's just the Umbraco without the views. And it's a data store. And every time there's an update, it just gets rolled out. So I just did like a quick test of how to actually build the code. There's various ways you can do it. There's .NET Core you can do. I think, Paul, you've got a blog on it, I think, how to get started with it. Yeah. So yeah, the query builder is something that you use their published content service, and that lets you access the items using this queryable Fluent API language. So yeah, you probably can't see that well, but it's basically, I either do this just by saying, get me all the events by this name, or I can say, get me all items of this event type. So I had to create an event class to actually do this, and that just inherits from the content base, and then you give, this is how it works at the moment, not to say it might not evolve, but you give the properties the exact same name as your doc type properties, and then you've got your strongly typed content model. So you're kind of rolling your own. If you get those wrong, like if there's a typo, it doesn't blow up, it just doesn't pull it back. But it does still pull everything down on the wire, so it's not like GraphQL kind of on demand. And yeah, I just wanted to show that I just got a .NET Core website, just the out-of-the-box one, working, and also a console app, and I just requested the event, and that actually worked. So that's one approach, is the pure kind of Umbraco headless approach. What we actually did was something like a hybrid. So we built our own headless. We put a web API layer in front of Umbraco itself. And essentially, you end up with a very similar thing, but we managed to get the website rolled out very quickly, whilst the API layer was built and the mobile developers could work on it. So, again, if we wanted to now create a new channel, we could then just request it from the API that we've built. So yeah, now we're coming to the part where we're actually crossing the streams. So the mobile development team working alongside the Umbraco development team. I'm not a mobile app developer, so but when I did this talk before, Chris, he was doing the Xamarin Forms development, so he did all the Xamarin Forms bit. But I've had a look at it, and I'm familiar with C#. So, and essentially, what we want to do is build a companion app that wasn't just like a mobile version of the website. We wanted to have an actual engaging reason to use the application. So we wanted it to feel like it actually belonged to the site. So that was our website, and then the actual app you can get on the App Store, but the event's over now. But we used the same branding feed, so we could get the same logo, same color scheme, everything like that, via our branding feed. And the companion app as well, it really needs to have some sort of shared functionality, so you don't feel jolted out of what you're familiar with when you go onto the app. So we replicate the same colors, we replicated the same kind of search and filtering for the events. And our goals for it were, we wanted so native look and feel, and we wanted to actually utilize the offline data, so we wanted there to be a reason for people to use the app. And this history festival, you're often walking around old buildings and cellars and things, so you might go offline and not get data, but we wanted it to still be usable. And we wanted to help people get to the event on time with the notifications. And we wanted it to be cross-platform. So this is 2017. Things have evolved quite a lot since then, very quickly. I think if we were to do it now, we'd probably use progressive web apps. But at the time, Xamarin Forms was our choice. Is anyone Xamarin Forms dev here or played with it? No. So yeah, we had a very small team of just one person to do this app as well. And basically, this is the kind of overview of what the Xamarin Forms had. So we've got the C# layer, which then you work with the Xamarin Forms XAML, which is just an XML kind of UI layer, which then translates down to the native type. So you put your kind of controls that you want in this XAML layer, and then whichever native application you're using it will actually create the right ones for each one. So that's how Xamarin Forms works, but again, we could have used a different approach. But really the key, again, like I said, was the API specification. So this is an example of what we had. I know you can use things like Swagger and that sort of thing, but for us, we just had a shared Google Doc. And we had what the request was, what the response should be, and any parameters and things that needed to be passed in. So we all agreed on this up front, and any changes that needed to go in, we made sure that was kept up to date. This meant that while the mobile dev team, or Chris, were actually working, he could start developing before we'd even finished the Umbraco CMS. So he managed to actually build everything test first, because he could just fake all the responses he was going to get in advance. So he used a load of stub data, and he just developed as if it was real. And when we switched it on and made the real API work, everything just worked because we'd already developed it to that spec. So yeah, this is just a representation of what the actual app did. He used the repository pattern to get the data. This session object just provides the context for the app. And then this was the client API, which we built, which is Web API, which actually went to Umbraco CMS to get data back. So how did we do this? Well, like I said, we used a Web API. This is just one way of doing it. You could probably use Examine if you needed to do something a bit more complex, but we have this thing called a content fetcher, which just like wraps the Umbraco helper, and so we can make it have an interface and makes testing a lot easier. And then we just did this typed content, get me everything on the events node, and basically just return it as a list of events. And that's all it does. We also had the changes from, which is important to know because we didn't want to just pull down everything every time. We actually wanted to say, keep on the application when it had last requested the data, so it knows it only needs data from a certain time. And then this was the actual method that we used to get the event. So we had to do some custom routing because we wanted it to be API events, not Umbraco API. And yeah, then we just kind of passed in the changes from. There we go, that was it. That was our API. Now, we could have done things like webhooks and, we could have had that, but we didn't need it. There wasn't that many people really using the app, to be honest. But if we needed to, we could say, have a webhook, which meant that we could be notified that there had been changes rather than going and actively requesting. So what about data getting out of date? Because it's quite important. If an event's sold out or changes location or cancelled, we definitely want to make sure we know about this. So we pulled all the data. We didn't want to lock the user, annoy the user or anything. So we had this spinning indicator while the data was being re-downloaded. So the user could still engage with their application while they were waiting for their updates. And that's just that little spinner there, just to show what's happening in the background. So this was async, and Chris just chose to do it hourly, send in the timestamp of when it was last requested, and then we got our data back. And you don't really need to see this. It's just to show that Chris's code was C#. If you're familiar with C#, we were kind of working with the same shared language, so we could all use the same testing frameworks and so on. So that was just some code that he got the JSON response and turned it into actual objects. And we wanted to make use of the location data on the device. So what we actually had was the Xamarin Forms map control, which meant that whichever device you're on, it would just use the mapping functionality for it. So it meant that we could say, you are this far from this event, and it's going to take you this long to get there, and you should probably leave now. So this was just some code we had to say, use the device's current position, and then we passed that in to our method that just said, get me the time it will take me to get to this location. It did a load of complex calculations and came back with how long and how far away. So that's just an example of how the companion app utilizes the data. And as I said, things have evolved a lot since then, so you could do similar things in the website now. But we built all of this in 1 month, so end-to-end on like a really small team. We got it finished, live, deployed, and in both app stores within a month, which I think kind of really shows the importance of this planning ahead with the content modeling, the API spec, and the team working together. There are other things that we did to help keep the teams in sync. So we had this specification, but we also did a lot of testing, unit testing, up where we needed to, not just for the sake of it, but where there was logic to test. We had a suite of tests that flagged any issues in the mobile build, which I accidentally did something, and Chris soon told me about it because he was just monitoring it. So that was good. We had App Center as well, so we had some people could just plug in and test the app on their own devices. And we used Scrum for the website build, and Chris just used Kanban for himself. I think if we did it again, we would definitely combine the teams, because essentially he was just on his own, but he didn't mind, he was fine. But, and then we had any updates that needed to be done. So the branding completely changed this year. That could just be done by publishing content in Umbraco, and then the branding feeds updated. Apart from the actual app icon, everything else was automatically refreshed in the app. So it made things a lot easier. We had CI, Team City, Octopus Deploy, but you could use your own flavor of choice. And it just meant that we had a staging environment for our API that Chris could point to when he wanted to test things on the app. So I think one of the main things about this whole experience was we followed the programming standards that we're familiar with and that we like to work with. So test-driven development, we could do that because of the way we were working. Keep it simple, stupid, or I don't like saying stupid. I think it should just be keep it simple. Solid principles, if you're familiar with those. I wrote an article about that. Talking about things like single responsibility and not having things closely coupled, keeping them nice separation of concerns. And we reused the branding feed in lots of areas, so we didn't have to duplicate effort. And we could work content first. Since this talk as well, so there's actually a headrest which Matt has built, and it's a REST-based headless approach for Umbraco. It's on GitHub, you can play with it. It's another way of using Umbraco in a headless way. So it's called headrest. So kind of a whirlwind tour of how we actually did our app development alongside Umbraco development, with the domain modeling in advance, and the really specific kind of API spec really helped us. So I recommend that approach to anyone working together on this. And I've got a load of resources and things if you want to find out more when the slides are shared. So has anyone got any questions about the process? Yeah.
Do you find it difficult
Getting content, yeah. Even with content first, sometimes, it's hard to get the content from users. Even on our own website, it always seems to be sometimes the last thing people think of. But if we make it really important, doing the content first approach, then you have a lot longer of a time scale. So you could use something like Contentful or something to put the content in early. And because we already know the domain model, then you give your editors a longer time scale to get content. I think it's just sharing how important the content is, and it's driving the site. But yeah, it's definitely, for some reason, it's a bit of a drag. I think sometimes people are a bit nervous to put content in, and yeah, I do. Do you?
Yes.
Yeah. Anyone else got any questions? Yeah.
Did you find any kind of disconnect between how easy it would be to, especially around deployment, how easy it is to get a website deployed to Zero, and how difficult it is sometimes to get an app deployed to the App Store?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. The process of getting Chris's app approved took a lot longer for Apple than it did for Android. And it was interesting seeing it for myself, seeing how a mobile app developer had to kind of account for that as part of the overall estimate of time. You know, mustn't forget that we've got to, if we do any updates, then we've got to go and put a new release in the App Store. And whereas with our continuous integration environment, like you say, it's there. It's there almost immediately. So it's definitely another level, something to consider in estimation and, you know, bug fixes. Got to put a new version of the app out. So yeah, I did find that interesting as an experience. Anyone else? In that case, then you can enjoy the drinks. Thanks for watching.